Good afternoon and welcome to the Computer Society July Membership Learning Webinar Series on Standards hosted by the current president of the IEEE Computer Society, Roger Fuji. This webinar is an introductory description of the standards process used by the Computer Society to generate its world-class 300-plus software engineering standards. The agenda, what we'll cover today is the type of standards, how standards are developed or how they are started, developed, how they get adopted and approved, and we'll go over the list of standards that the Computer Society has played a role in. A little bit about Roger. Roger is a senior industry executive and long-term CS volunteer involved in many IEEE Society functions. In publications, he served as Press Operations Committee Chair, recently Publications Special Committee Member and Guest Editor of Software Magazine. He served as Conference Program Chair, VP Standards Board, 1012 IEEE Standard Working Group Chair, and U.S. Chair of ISO IEC International Standards. In 2011, he led the CS Strategic Plan Development. He was a CS First VP of Board of Governors member and served as IEEE Director 2012 through 14 Board of Directors. And as I mentioned earlier, currently Computer Society President. On top of all of Roger's volunteer duties, he is President of Fuji Systems, specializing in executive searches. He is a retired VP at Northrop Grumman, where he managed a $1.86 billion division developing F-22, F-35 communication systems, and has lectured at UCLA and Sacramento State University. He also served on the National Academy of Sciences Committee for the Space Shuttle. Roger holds a BS, MS in Electrical Engineering from the University of California, Berkeley, and studied business management at Harvard, UCLA, and Darden, and is a contributing author of 2 books and is presented on numerous papers. He is also an IEEE Fellow, CS Golden Core member, and 2010 CIE Executive of the Year. Before we jump into the presentation, just a little housekeeping. From previous webinars, a lot of the questions that were asked, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on computer.org in about a week. We'll send out notification when it's posted, and you can access it right there on computer.org. We will try to get to all questions that you chat, but if for some reason yours is overlooked, we have a log of all the chats and unanswered questions, and we will respond to you within a few days if we have to do research. A lot of times questions are asked and we do not have the immediate answer. So with all of that, I'm just going to go ahead now and pass it over to Roger, who's going to give you an overview of our standards processes. Roger?
Thank you, Eric. Well, good morning to everybody on the West Coast. Good afternoon to those of you in the Midwest and in the East Coast, and good evening to those of you who may be calling in from overseas. Welcome to this introductory discussion of standards. I am very proud of the Computer Society and all the things that we do, and one of the things that I have heard in all of my travels visiting all the different countries and talking to people and trying to understand what they know about the Computer Society, there are 2 things that literally always are mentioned as the things that the world knows the Computer Society most by. And number 1 is all of our world-class publications. We have something like 32 different magazines and transactions that cover a very, very broad spectrum of technology subjects. But secondly, they know us by standards. Standards play a very important role in international commerce and in the way in which we operate. So I want to talk a little bit about standards today. And so let me go to the first page here. Okay. There we go. So we have 2 types of basic standards. One is called a product standard, where the standard describes the characteristics of a specific product. I'll be talking about some of those examples here in a bit. But the second one is talking about process standards. That is the process that one goes through in order to consistently perform activities that are related to whatever field that the process is talking about. In our case, we're talking about computer engineering processes. And this is very important that there is a consistent and common way in which we all follow certain processes. And so we'll talk a little bit about those as well. But, in essence, in each of these areas, standards are used to codify certain types of general categories. One, it's to codify existing best practices or procedures. So in essence, this particular type of standard is one that's going to be developed after a certain amount of time has passed when people are following certain practices and have modified them and found that ultimately a certain set of those practices are ones that have been proven to be valuable, and they want to share those practices across the board as a way to get consistency on how everybody performs certain actions. Another type of standard, though, is dealing with emerging technologies. This is where usually this deals with product standards, where the people in the commercial space want to get together and develop a common set of standards. Wi-Fi is a good example of this, where everybody would like to build the next 802.11 and whatever number we're at, probably M, N, P, Q, R, S, whatever it might be, that talks about the type of technology that industry would like to build products to. Now, one way to deal with this is to let the economics of the marketplace take effect and everybody sort of build their own version of these products, and then ultimately the consumers will, by deciding on which products that they like the best, are deciding upon which approach that they think is the best approach. Industry has, in this instance on Wi-Fi, has taken the attitude that this is not going to be very economically feasible for corporations to deal this way. So what they have done is banded together, and they have meetings to decide on what the next Wi-Fi 802.11 S or T would be. And it's a very, very arduous process because everybody is discussing the latest approach. But what that does is once that approach or the definition is codified, then all of these industries can instantly begin building that product, and therefore everybody builds the same product. Then it becomes an issue of the actual price point of the product and the advertising that will go with it in the first to market sort of principles. So that's another type of standard. There are standards that deal with regulatory policy, and I'll cover some of these in the next slide. And of course, the ones that we have always known from the historical times is weights and measures. So if you buy a pound of something, a pound is the same here as it is in Japan, as it is in England, as it is in India, or a liter of liquid, and so forth. So these are very, very important ways in which standards can codify for the economic benefit of all of the industries and as well as the public. The common one that's often talked about is like the train tracks. Obviously, you don't want to have train tracks that will change in their dimensions as you go from one territory to the next. For obvious reasons, then a train in one territory could not transition over to the next territory. There are certain types of areas that we would also like to see standards, but they are not for competitive reasons. For example, and I think we all can relate to this, our laptops can either run Windows or they can run Mac operating systems. Both of those entities or those industries have decided to stay separate because what they have developed is a constituency of consumers who are either Windows-based or Mac-based. And that's done on purpose, and that's done for competitive reasons. So it would be nice if we had one set of operating systems, whether it's Mac or Windows. That way, whatever computer you buy, it will be the common one. However, they are different. Now, what has happened due to economic pressures, though, is that some of the applications and the interfaces have been able to transition between these two operating systems. So in a way, we get some interoperability, even though the original operating system may not have started that way. So that's an example of where just the desire to have a competitive advantage or desire to maintain what they feel are the basic ingredients of what they're offering, different than the other, does not encourage them to develop the same standard way of approaching a particular problem solution. So that gives you a little bit of a backdrop on the types of standards that exist. The next slide I want to bring up talks to the benefits of standards. We've been sort of chatting about this here now a little bit. Here we go. Obviously, it promotes global economics because now, like I say, a pound of anything is the same in England as it is in the U.S. And so when products are packaged and it's labeled as a pound of this or a pound of that or a liter of this, it is exactly that because everybody knows and they can trust that that standard was followed. No one cheats, or if they do cheat, obviously they can be prosecuted. There's also ways in which people need to interact with one another, and this is the question of to be able to interoperate with existing services and products. And so standards help to facilitate that, to bridge that gap between two things that may be dissimilar, but there's a common way in which that gap is bridged, and everybody can rely upon that. So again, that's a tremendous benefit. Obviously, there's a lot of regulatory types of standards. These deal with the kind of things that we have come to trust and has caused our basic way of living to improve significantly. That is the quality of the air, the quality of the water. There are some standards on what constitutes the minimum requirement such that you can always trust that if that standard is followed, that you can be safe in consuming the food or drinking the water and so forth. In our new electronic age, obviously there's a lot of interoperability requirements between different entities and different devices. Obviously, one of the ones that we're most familiar with, those of us who do a lot of traveling, is that the electrical and voltage systems of different countries, we've now settled on two types so that you can carry these adapters. The voltage are the same, but perhaps the actual connection mechanism is a little different from place to place. But we have now tended to start to narrow that down so that we don't have to carry a ton of different adapters with us. There's probably, 7 or 6 that you need to have, and once you have that, you can interoperate. There are acceptable practices. GAAP stands for the General Accepted Accounting Practice. It's a way in which accountants can say that they can talk to one another and, we can exchange information. Signage. We have now gotten to the point where I think there's a lot of symbols that are universal, and you can count on those as being telling you where the hospital is, or the sign for the hospital, sign for danger, and so forth. Color also now is becoming acceptable in terms of certain colors have a meaning to it under certain circumstances, and that is helpful so that you don't have to always be able to read the words that go with it. The sign itself gives you some information. So all of this affects our daily lives in a very, very positive way. And so standards plays a vital part in that. On the next slide, I want to talk to you a little bit, show you some of the computer society standards that we have. I do want to acknowledge certain people that are on the phone today. I saw their names on the list. If there are other names that piped up that I may not acknowledge, just forgive me for not seeing your name. but Mark Polk is online. Mark is the current Vice President of the Computer Society Standards Activities Board. So Mark, welcome. Also, we have Chris Schobert. She is a member of the Computer Society Board of Governors. She's online. And also we have a bunch of people that I recognize who are active in standards. Carl Singer. Carl is, I guess you are the secretary for the Software Systems and Software Engineering Standards Committee. That is the first one listed there. Ron Dean is a member of my working group, 1012, the working group for standards on software verification validation. Rob Rogers also, and Herb Hecht is online. Those are names that I recognize on this list. There may be others that, well, I see Christine Miyachi, she's cloud computing. So we have a lot of people online that have standards in their background. Welcome aboard. But here's the list of the standards. We have not the entire list. The Computer Society has over 300 world-class standards. This is what one of the things that we are known for. The top two there play a very, very important role in helping to define processes. These are processes for life cycles. The system life cycle standard is the ISO, IEC, and IEEE standard 15288. So this is the one that's cited in all major contracts now in defining what the stages of the system life cycle should be and what should be expected out of those stages of the life cycle. So obviously, if you're developing anything for a global nature, following this standard is vitally important. Similarly, and what preceded the 15288 was the software lifecycle standard, and that was ISO IEC standard 12207. I am very familiar with 12207 because when I was the United States chairman, this is the standard that we promoted. So it was developed under my watch as the United States delegation head. But this started as an IEEE standard, and we brought it to the international community. Obviously, it got modified and improved significantly, and the original IEEE standard was 1074. Once we became an ISO IEC standard, it got the new number 12207, and 12207 has been used for many, many years now, and it has been cited in numerous contracts, and again has been one of the instrumental set of standards that is helping to promote international business in a common way. The next few are the ones that are the first few standards that came out of the Computer Society in software. The one on quality assurance was the first one that came out, and it has the number 730. So you can sort of tell from these the number that what their age is. The smaller the number, the longer they have been in existence. My standard, that is the one I'm the working group chair of, is also the fifth standard that came out of the software arena, and this is the System, Software, and Hardware Verification and Validation standard. It is used now to certify all critical systems. That is, software systems that have any kind of impact on human life, safety, or security. So NASA uses this, the Department of Defense for all critical nuclear weapon systems, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and all of the nuclear power plants are using this standard as a way to, again, to determine whether or not the instrumentation and control system of nuclear power plants is safe and secure. So again, this is one of those regulatory requirements that are being used across the world to ensure that there is a safe and sound environment for the software and the system in which it operates in. And you see some of the others, the configuration management, reviews and audits. Of course, the 802 family is the local and wide area network standards. They have many, many standards that they're generating, and they are generating the current new Wi-Fi standards that are coming out. They will probably be instrumental in developing the 5G standards that will be coming out that will probably overtake Wi-Fi at some point in time. You see cloud computing. Cloud computing has working standards also, storage technology, information assurance, and so forth. There's a longer list than this. I only copied down a certain number here just so that you get a feel for the breadth of the standards work that's occurring in the Computer Society. I hope, and I think many of you may be participating, and I'm not aware of it, but I thank you for participating. Standards is very, very important for what we do. I want to briefly touch upon the process by which standards are developed. And so I clicked on that slide here. Let's see if it comes up. There it goes. Okay. So I tried to make it simple so that it wouldn't spill over into too many pages. But the first thing is called the PAR. It's a Project Authorization Request. So an individual, a group of people, or industry consortium can get together and say, you know, I think we could use a standard on Wi-Fi, or we could use a standard on software quality. We need to define these things. And so initially there's this little informal group that probably gets together and kind of decides whether or not there's enough consensus to begin a standards activity on it. And if so, then what they do is they submit a project authorization request, which is a form that they fill out that describes the scope of the standard, what the schedule will be, and what the end result will be in terms of the product. This is then passed to one of those standards development committees that will review the material, and if it has merit, they will approve it. It then goes to the Standards Association, the IEEE Standards Association, for their approval, and once that is approved, then there is a number that gets assigned in sequence. So these standards that coming out gets the next number in the sequence. And so that particular working group then has a number associated with it. So when you saw on my standard on software verification validation, it's 1012. That was our number from, I think we began our standard in 1985. So that was the number we got assigned in 1985. Every single revision we have made to the standard still carries that number, but following that number there's a dash and it gives the date. So we just approved our 6th revision to 1012. So when you see that, my standard now, when it gets published here in August, it'll see IEEE standard 1012-2016. But the working group will then form. It convenes by inviting all interested parties. There is no restriction to who may attend as long as you have a vested interest. Whether you're a corporation or an individual or a consultant, it doesn't matter. Everybody has equal weight. This working group forms and they begin drafting the contents of a standard. The working group nominates and elects a chairperson, a vice chair, and a secretary. Those are the 3 minimum positions that are required of a working group. That working group then holds regular meetings. In my case, I hold a meeting every quarter. One of the companies or one of the universities will be hosting us, so they provide us basically with a conference room. So in fact, my next working group will be in August, and we're meeting at the University of Montana. We have various participants from China as well as all the major Department of Defense, NASA, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and interested parties, consultants will attend. And you develop the standard. And I will try to take you through on the last chart that I have a little bit of how a standard kind of starts to evolve. But once the working group has determined that they have written the material to their satisfaction, they will request that the standards committee, one of those committees I just mentioned to you just in the previous chart, their parent effectively, to create a balloting group. Those are all called. Many of you have received these emails saying, do you want to join the following balloting group for, let's say, software quality assurance standard? And if you say yes, you'll be put on the list, and you will receive the actual ballot, and you will receive the draft material that the working group has generated. You will ballot on that standard. If you vote no on any particular part of the standard, you must supply the language that you would want to see replaced with the new language, and you have to supply it. You just can't say, no, I don't like it, and let that be your answer. You have to supply the alternative language. If not, your response is considered to be non-responsive. So generally what happens, because a standard, usually if it's undergone some kind of major revision or if it's a first-time standard, does pick up a lot of comments. So what happens is that it's cycled back to the working group. The working group can elect to go ahead and still submit their standard for publishing. The minimum rule is you have to have 75% affirmative votes. But even if you get 75%, if there's enough people that have made comments, generally the working group feels compelled to make those changes to accommodate the comments. So they will generate a second draft, and then they will go through a second ballot. If additional comments come back from that ballot, the cycle will continue until the working groups feel satisfied that they really have addressed all of the comments, and that the number of comments they're getting obviously reduces, and they will feel that they have a consensus. That then is then forwarded to their parent for approval. The parent, in this case, the Standards Association, and will review the process that was followed, and if it concurs that everybody made a good attempt to satisfy every single comment, and that a technical review of the material says that the material is of value, then they will accept it as a standard, and they will then authorize it for publishing. Now that is in a quick cycle of what happens during the life of a standards development. Now this whole process, probably the minimum time it takes for any standard to be built on this process is 3 years. Usually the balloting process usually takes anywhere from 6 to 9 months. So out of the minimum of a 3-year process, you're almost losing 1 year to the actual balloting process itself. So that means that the working group has to write its PAR and develop the standard in less than 2 years. That's why most standards are going beyond the 3 years. Many of them are averaging around 4.5, almost 5 years now, because this process is a very rigorous process. By the way, this process is one that's fair to all parties, because everybody has an opportunity to comment who are on the balloting group. And the working group must respond to every single comment. They can reject the comment, or they can accept it and indicate what changes they made to the standard. The international community has considered this process that's been developed by the IEEE to be the premier process for fairness and for getting a consensus. So you should be proud of the fact that this process is one that's world-class and one that is envied by everybody in the world of standards. They feel that nothing can happen without due process being followed, and that the process that the IEEE has established here is one that is very, very sound and is fair to all involved. So those of you who are following this process, you ought to be complimented for this process. My last slide just takes you through an example of how a standard kind of evolves. So I just picked one. You know, I just said, okay, let's write a few statements on what constitutes a standard for a software requirement. So I just sort of, off the top of your head, one would say, software requirements shall define the performance functions of the desired solution. Each requirement shall be correct, unambiguous, testable, feasible, and complete. Now, the key word here is wherever there is the word shall, then anything that follows that is what you are requiring be done. Now, this set of statements might be reasonable, but it's the first cut. And usually what happens is as people think about it, they may say, well, I think there's more to it than just those two statements. So maybe on the second draft you say, really software requirements are not just performance requirements. They're interface requirements, they're quality requirements, they're safety requirements, security, reliability, and maintainability of the desired solution. So now that's a more robust statement of what you want in a software requirement. But the second statement stays the same, but the third statement, we said, but we want to talk a little bit more about the individual requirement itself. And in that case here, we can have an additional statement that says each requirement shall define the subject of the requirement, the action desired, the object of the action, the destination of the action, the frequency of the action, wherever, when applicable, and conditions for the action to occur, again, if applicable. Now, that then gives a little bit more robust treatment of what you would like to see in software requirements. Now, again, probably on further thought, you have other thoughts you probably can add. So this is how a standards development works. Usually at each of these meetings, everybody chimes in, we add more information, more clarity, and that's why it does take 3 to 4 years for the standard to evolve and become more robust, become better, become more comprehensive and complete. So that's the reason why the process takes so long. And of course, because you're relying upon volunteers to contribute their time, you can't meet every month, and that's why usually maybe meeting quarterly is maybe the most you can expect people to be able to contribute time or companies to send representatives to these meetings. So that kind of gives you some of the rationale of why it takes so long. It's not 3 people sitting down and writing the standards and then putting it out for ballot. It requires this interaction, this dialogue, and through that interaction and dialogue, you get a better solution and a more comprehensive solution, and one that is going to address all of the different industries that may want to use that standard. So one of the important considerations is the standard isn't written for those industries that are perhaps the more mature industries. It's also written for those that are both emerging or smaller industries have to use the same standard. So you don't want to overly encumber the process when you have smaller organizations that are trying to use it. So this is usually the pull and tug that you have in the standards development. Are we over-specifying too much requirement of what needs to be done? At the same time, you want to say enough so that you don't get something that's a little half-baked. And that's the dialogue which is usually occurring in these working groups. So it's an interesting dialogue, it's an interesting debate that occurs during these working group meetings about how much information is necessary. Again, you don't want to tell people what to do, you want to, how to do it, you want to tell them what to do so that they can use various techniques. And of course, technology will change over time, so you want to stay away from writing language that ties you to a particular technology, because then your standard becomes outdated the moment that technology becomes outdated. So there's a lot of things to think about as you develop the actual content of the standard. So I thought I would stop here and allow people to ask me questions, and that would allow me to take and answer, the things I could have put in other slides. So I think we have some questions now evolving here. So John, Scott, I'm to read the question and indicate who it's from and then try to answer it. Is that the process we're going to follow now?
Yeah, that works for me if it works for you.
Okay. John Montague says, is there a process on including in a standard exactly what steps must be satisfied in order to claim compliance? The answer is yes, but you shouldn't be too overly prescriptive where only certain industries or certain size industries can use your standard. So you would have to describe your tests in a way that's generic. And yet give criteria that's also generic about describing, for example, what is correctness, what constitutes the parameters of correctness, and then you can describe that in a genericness. So, for example, what we have said in the verification validation standard on correctness is we said you must comply with the physical or business laws that govern your solution. Now, that doesn't then get specific about whether it's for a space flight mission or for a nuclear power plant's instrumentation control system or some other system. That definition I've given, whatever the physical laws and the business laws are for your solution, then become the criteria for determining correctness. So it's a way for you to be specific without being overly pedantic about a specific industry's approach. So again, this is the art of writing a standard. You have to have that level of understanding. So in general, what we are finding is that the people who are the best standards writers are the more senior people, because they have this experience base and they know what becomes overly prescriptive and what can be written in a generic way and yet give very good information to the user or the reader of the standard. So the development of the standard is a very, very, I think, rewarding process, because there's a lot of intellectual thought process that goes into writing the actual words that go into a standard. Okay, so John, I hope that answers. I'm not sure I can pronounce this next name. Shreyas, I would like to know if Wi-Fi is being made a standard right now, or Li-Fi. There are variations that are being standardized right now. The 802 group, if you were to contact them, and Paul Nikolic is the lead of that, or Mark Falk, if you want to reach out to Mark. Mark can put you in the right direction. The answer to your question there is yes. Sharice, again, if I am building an electronic product and I want to make it available in the market, when do I get them certified, and where do I see all standards that I need to meet? The way that happens is either two ways. Number one, the market, that is the developers, will say, if you develop a product and you say, I have followed IEEE standard whatever in building my product, and I comply with everything in that standard, or standards, it might be plural, that is one way in which you communicate to the buyer what you've done. Also, there are times when various entities, such as underwriter labs, or even contracting agencies, such as the Department of Defense or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, would say, we are expecting you to be in compliance with the following standards, in which case, then those are the standards that you must comply with in order to be able to sell your product in that marketplace. So there will be ways in which it can be done. Sometimes it's certainly by a self-declaration. So if you're the only manufacturer of the product that declares you're satisfying these standards, and all the other manufacturers do not claim compliance with the standard, the chances are that a buyer will be more compelled to buy your product because the name IEEE is well known, and if you're complying with an IEEE standard, they feel that therefore your product must be better. So that's a little bit more touchy-feely, but I think that's the right answer. Alan asks, does IEEE make standards available to members for their personal use and learning? Well, just like everybody, Alan, we all have to buy the standards. So yes, you can buy it, and you buy it at your member price, but you don't get it for free. Now, if you were working on that standard, obviously you do get a free copy because you worked on it, and so the IEEE Standards Association gives you a free copy at the end of the development of that standard. Prasad says, does IEEE have links with other standard bodies, and how does the universal standards or developed organizations like ISO? Okay. Yes, we do have links to the ISO IEC standards. What we have done is we have taken our IEEE standards and we do attend the ISO IEC meetings, and that's what I was the United States chairman for. Representing the United States. Obviously, every country has their own representative, but Germany, for example, can bring to the international standard German standards. The United Kingdom can bring the British standards to the international arena. We brought our IEEE standards. We tend to be a little bit more transnational because we do have many members from across different countries who participate in development of our standards. So in that sense, IEEE has a slightly more I'll use the word powerful position, but I don't mean it exactly that way, but it's more, a global position. And when it's presented to the international group, then that group then decides on what changes or what standards they want to adopt. So we do interface with them. Loannis, what kind of volunteer work could an individual IEEE member provide to a working group of a specific standard, and how easy is this when you live outside the United States? Good question. First of all, if there is a standard that you're interested in, the name of the chair and their contact information, such as their email address as well as their phone number, is listed. So you can always contact them by email and ask to be put on the working group list. We have many working group members in my working group who do not have the opportunity to travel to the United States to attend my working group meetings. But what they do is they get all of our draft material, and you can comment by email on the draft material. And so you can be a corresponding working group member through email, and your information then is read at the working group meetings, and people can comment on that. We also open up the phone line during our meeting on one of the days for 3 hours, in which you can call into an 800 toll-free number and ask your questions and make any comments as well. So various working groups operate in that same way. But I would say if you're interested in a very specific standard, you can always contact that working group chair, and they will be more than glad to put you on the mailing list. And if you're able to do the analysis and provide written comments, they will definitely accept your comments. Najib, who are the balloting groups and how are they formed? The balloting group is formed totally by volunteers, so the call goes out by email from the standards committee, and it says the following standard is now ready for balloting. Do you wish to become a balloting member? Obviously, to be a balloter, you have to be an IEEE member, and you have to be a member of the Standards Association. So there are two parts to that. If you are, then you will be added to the balloting group, and you will get sent the actual draft standard, and you will have to then be required to ballot on that standard. So it's as easy as that, but if you haven't gone through the steps, perhaps it might feel a little intimidating, but it is very easy to join. You should be an IEEE member, and you have to be an IEEE Standards Association member as well. Okay. Karthi Kenyan. Design behind the standard specifications are formulated within standards meetings far outside of standardization process. Formulated. Well, the actual development the design of the standard specification are part of the standardization process. So I'm not quite sure I fully understand your question. Let me answer it that way. If I haven't answered it correctly, why don't you restate your question and then put it on the list again. I'll come back to it. Sergi, are there any templates or samples of standard documents and where we could get them? Templates. Let me think for a second here. I don't think there's a standard. Well, there's a template in the sense that if you look at all standards, there's a foreword, there's an introductory section, there's a section that you have to write on acronyms and definitions. There's the scope section and a few other required mandatory sections or clauses, as they're called. But other than that, then the content is whatever you determine it to be. So there is no template for the rest of what your standard is going to address. And so you may define whatever template you want or approach you want for your content. So other than the initial part in the form, so there is a form, in the sense that, Clause 1 is always the introduction. Clause 2, I think, is scope. Clause 3 is definitions and acronyms and so forth. But once you get past around Clause 4, I think, then the rest is open. You obviously want to have a bibliography list. So there are certain things like that that are kind of templates. But other than that, Obviously, kind of other general rules like whenever you write something, if you write it as if something has to be a requirement, you have to use the verb shall. You can't use must, you can't be should or things of that nature. The verb shall is the defining verb that says whatever follows is the requirement of the standard. So things of that nature are kind of the rules of how you write standards. Okay. Quentin, could you give us a brief history of the foundation of IEEE Standards Association? Okay. Yes. When the Computer Society first started writing standards, there was no Standards Association. But it quickly became evident as we began to write the policies and procedures for how we would be operating within the Computer Society in formulating standards that there was the possibility of liability associated with anybody who uses that standard and something bad happens in the course of some product being used or maybe some process not catching something and therefore there's liability. So in order to protect IEEE from that liability, the Standards Association was formed. So it is a self-contained legal entity within IEEE, and that's where all of the standards reside, and the issues of legal responsibility reside with the Standards Association. Also, the Standards Association was the final oversight organization to ensure that due process was followed in terms of the balloting process and the resolution of comments and so forth. So, Quentin, that's the background and that's the history. I tried to abbreviate it a little bit. I hope that's sufficient. Murray, are there any groups interested in Agile development practices and/or usable assurance? Yes. If so, which ones? Thanks. Murray, you're hitting on a very hot topic these days. There is some discussion about there being perhaps it won't be a standard because there are different ways in which Agile is being done. But perhaps they're thinking about writing what they call a recommended practices. They'll use the word standard, but it's not a standard. Basically, recommended practices of different approaches of Agile. I know that in 10.12, in verification validation, we are addressing Agile because obviously Agile presents a slightly modified system and software lifecycle to us. And how we then apply verification validation to an Agile development is different than some of the traditional software lifecycles that exist. So we are going to write some language that's going to go into an annex that will go into our standards. So people are addressing Agile in that way, but I don't know whether an actual working group has formed to actually write the examples of various Agile methods itself, but there has been discussion about that. George, I'm just looking at time here. Let me stop here for a second. Scott, what's our time limit here?
No real time limit. We were supposed to end about 2:30, but Roger, I think there's only 2 or 3 questions left, so we might as well just answer those and then wrap it up. Okay, great. We'll do that. So we'll answer those. We got 4 questions here, and so we'll answer those 4 and then stop and wrap up. So George said, is there a fast track process for standards or emerging technologies where 3 years may be too long? Related, what is the process for requesting an update to an existing standard? Okay, so it's a 2-part question. Yes, fast tracking. We are actually trying to do that with IEEE Standard 10.12. We are bringing it to the ISO IEC arena for fast tracking, meaning that we are telling the ISO group that our standard 10.12 now has been in existence for what, almost 30 years. And so many international organizations are using ISO on the IEEE Standard 10.12. And so would they consider fast tracking it, literally taking it intact, and then taking off the IEEE label and putting on the ISO IEC label with /IEEE label? It probably will get maybe a new number rather than 10.12 because, again, there's a numerical sequence to the ISO numbering.
So whatever that number is, we'll get that number, but then they just adopt the IEEE standard literally intact. Now that dialogue is occurring. That doesn't always happen because there's enough comments about, oh, we like this change or that change, that fast tracking doesn't happen. But there is a process for fast tracking. Rarely have we fast tracked anything at the IEEE level. That is, there aren't too many standards development organizations that develop standards in software so that they don't come over to us literally intact as a standard. All of the other standards organizations like the automobile and so forth are dealing with specific issues that deal with them. So far at the IEEE level, we have not fast-tracked anything yet. But that doesn't mean we couldn't do it, but there'll probably be a process very similar to what I described to you that happens at the ISO IEC arena. The material has to be examined for content to make sure that nothing in it violates our basic principles, and there will be some technical vetting on it to make sure that nothing is in that standard that would be disagreeable to our members. So I think that's a quick answer on that one. Paul, if you provide comments through email, do you get feedback from members who attended? Yes, usually in the meeting minutes to a working group, we will read the comments we've gotten from members who submitted email questions, and in the meeting minutes there'll be what our resolution was to the question that we get asked through email. So you can find a response in the meeting minutes. And again, if that person were to dial in on that toll-free number, they will also be able to hear the answer as well. Okay. So, Karthi, Kenya, is the real work to developing standards occur outside of working group meetings or within working group meetings? The answer is both. People get homework assignments, that is, get action items. They have to work up, let's say, a draft of a particular section. They then bring it to the working group meeting, and then it's discussed, and it's usually modified. So it's a combination of both. A lot of the work does occur outside of the meeting, but then the final approval of any content is discussed in the working group meetings themselves, and generally nothing ever goes in without some changes because enough people have differing thoughts, and it does improve the content, by the way. So we know that process works. So it's both. You do some of the initial homework outside the meeting, and you bring it to the meetings, and it gets usually improved during the meeting discussion. And last comment is working group meeting transcripts open to public or IEEE members? Well, it's not a transcript, it's the meeting minutes. It's open to IEEE working group members. It's not publicized generally. So you have to be a member of the working group to see the content. Okay, I think that's the last question. And I thank everybody for attending. Appreciate those of you who are working on standards, all your hard work. It's been one of our showcases, and we are very appreciative of all your efforts. So, Eric, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Roger. That was very informative. I hope everybody enjoyed that session on standards. I know I learned quite a bit. Just want to let everybody know that these are monthly calls. In August, we're really excited. We're really excited about this one coming up. We're introducing a new member experience for the 2017 membership year, which really allows the flexibility for our members to customize the solutions that they want to help excel in their careers. It's going to be towards the end of August, but it's really exciting. We're introducing a new way of doing business, and we think our members are really going to adopt to it and appreciate the changes that we're making. So that's going to be the end of February. Watch for that. And with that, I bid you all a good day. So thank you for joining us today. It was very informative, and keep a lookout for upcoming events. Thanks.